Good morning. Welcome to IETA live webinar. What does the proposed minus 90% target mean for the EU ETS? We are very glad that you are joining us today, and we are sorry for a couple of minutes delay due to technical issues. The webinar starts with a small delay, but hopefully from now onwards, everything will go very smoothly. My name is Julia Michalak, and I'm EU Policy Director at IETA Brussels office, and I'm delighted to be a moderator of today's event and have 4 outstanding speakers that will discuss in detail the 90% target impact on the EU ETS. To start with, I'd like to remind everyone that it's already 2 months since the Commission communication on the 2040 target has been published, so we all had time to digest and read not just the communication, but also quite a detailed impact assessment that accompanied this publication. It seems like it's been just a moment ago as time flies, but there were already a couple of weeks since the publication that allowed us to reflect on what the Commission has proposed. So to just remind everyone, the Commission looked at 3 mitigation scenarios. The first one, emission reduction of up to 80%. The second one in between 85% and 80% and 85 and 90%, and the third one from at least 90 to 95% emission reductions, and then recommended a 90% emission reduction target for the EU by the year 2030, by the year 2040, of course. Though there was not in the communication a specific trajectory presented for the 90% net emission reduction target. And this is something that we'd like to discuss today. We'd like to look more into detail on what perhaps has not been presented in a direct way in the Commission documents, and what it means for the EU's main emission reduction policy instrument, the EU's emissions trading scheme, but also what's the way forward. What will be the way for the EU ETS to evolve, but also what are the political milestones and the timeline for the 2040 target to be agreed and later on to be put in practice. I would like to say thank you to all the panelists that joined us today. We can go to next slides. We have with us Mette Quinn, who will speak first. She's a Deputy Director in DG Climate Action of the European Commission, responsible for the EU ETS. We have Unstead, who is a Senior Analyst, EU Carbon at ICIS, who will share with us his analytical work on what the 2040 target would mean for the evolution of the EU ETS. Afterwards, the floor will be given to Felix Schenuit from German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Felix is a research associate, and he will speak more in detail about the role of carbon removals under the 2040 climate target. And afterwards, Professor Dr. Wilfried Rickels from Kiel Institute for the World Economy will continue on that topic, looking a bit more at economics of carbon removals being integrated in the EU ETS and options for their governance. Without further delay, I will give now the floor to Mette Quinn to start with her presentation. Mette, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you for inviting me to this very interesting webinar on the 2040 framework that we have the EU ETS in. So even though we are centering around the 2040 target, I think it's important to know that it's complementary to the 2030 target that we have in place, minus 55% net greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. And this is what we are really focusing on now. We need to fully implement what has already been agreed under the European Green Deal and the Fit for 55. We are still preparing some of the implementing legislation on that. And in order to further reach for 2040 target, we need to have implemented our 2030 target. So I think that's my first comment. So why 90% is recommended? We have recommended this 90% reduction target of net greenhouse gas emissions compared to 1990 levels for 2040. This corresponds fully to the advice of the European Scientific Advisory Board on Climate Change, and they looked into a fair and feasible domestic mitigation contribution to the Paris Agreement's goal. So it's in line with the provisions of the European climate law also. And meeting this target will imply a cumulative emission of 16 gigatons CO2 equivalent between 31 and 50, which is the so-called greenhouse gas budget. So what role is there for the EU ETS to deliver the 90% target? I think we are all aware of the current ETS, and with the recent revision we have had on the ETS directive, including expanding the ETS to maritime and creating a new ETS for road transport, building and small industry, and other Fit for 55 policies. We know that if we would extend the current policies that we already have in place, that would lead to a minus 88% economy-wide emission reduction by 2040. That is according to our impact assessment that came with the 2040 communication. So we have already in place, and we are already good on the way towards that target. The EU ETS legislation that we just adopted last year will contribute with a big part to this. First of all, we cover the sectors in the existing and the new emission trading system of around 75% of the economy, ETS 1 and ETS 2 together. We have a strong linear reduction factor, so we will decrease emissions a lot every year. And this goes to 2030, but also beyond. And this will lead us to a cap that is close to zero around 2040 in the EU ETS 1. And it will be reaching zero in 2044 when we have the EU ETS 2. So what are the options for reform of the EU ETS? We will have to see after the elections, the European elections that are going to take place here this spring, and we will also have a new commission in place. And they are going to, we are expecting that they will put forward a proposal for a concrete 2040 target. And then we will afterwards need to align and prepare the broader policy framework for climate policy, including for the ETS, to deliver that new target. And implementing such a 90% reduction target would require contribution from all sectors, not only the existing ETS sectors, but also other sectors. What we will do in the EU ETS is that we will now have a review in 2026. It's been put in the ETS directive that we will have to look at a number of important issues. Let me start by the negative emissions. So at the moment, the EU ETS includes carbon capture and storage. So if you store emissions that have been permanently stored very soundly, then you don't need to surrender an allowance for that captured CO2. But if we just take the CO2 and remove it out of the atmosphere, and it's not embedded in the feedstock, we capture it and we store it permanently, then we would provide for an additional negative emission. But at the moment, this is not accounted for in the ETS. So what we're going to look at now for the 26 review, and we have to report on how negative emissions that are removed from the atmosphere and that are safely and permanently stored could be accounted for in the ETS. And we will also need to look at whether such negative emissions could be covered by emission trading. And that is a general term, so it's not necessarily referring to ETS 1. And we would have to look at the scope, the criteria, and the safeguards to ensure that the inclusion of the removals do not deter emission reductions. And I think that's a very important point that we need to look into. So we have also, just together with the 2040 communication, also launched the industrial carbon management strategy for recounting of removals in the ETS. And this state that we could either integrate industrial carbon removals into the ETS, or we could create a separate compliance mechanisms for such removals and connect them in one way or another to the ETS, or we could have no integration at all. And we are going to look at all these options because there are risks and there are benefits for integration. Some of the benefits that we can already see for integration could be that it supports the demand for removals, or it could support demand for removal, and thereby increase the investors' certainty that there will be a market for the removals, not just in support schemes, but real market. It could also mitigate the high cost of certain removals, and it could provide an alternative for the sectors that still have emissions when the cap is reaching or close to zero. So that's on the benefit side. But there are also a couple of shortcomings that we have to look into. There is indeed the risk that the integration of carbon removals impact the ETS market. We will have to see what consequences it has for the cap and for the price of the allowances, possibly. So also the exact role of the removals in the ETS may change if further innovation beyond the current production processes can be found. For example, substitute products in industrial carbon management, and also circular economy. And they have the potential to reduce the emissions quite a lot. And then coming back to the risk of integrating removals that could deter the mitigation. We have to clearly look into what safeguards need to be in place to ensure that removals do not offset necessary emission reductions. So scaling up removals should not be at the cost of not making the possible emission reductions. We really need to ensure that we do not disincentivize current investments in innovative production processes or new technologies with the promise of removals. The hard to abate emissions are not the same and will not be the same in the years to come. We already see an evolution over the past years of what is hard to abate and what will become hard to abate. So it's a bit of a moving target, and therefore it's very important that we very sensitively look at how we can maintain full incentive to continue to decarbonize, but also how we can incentivize that the removals are scaled up. So the ETS could be a source of demand for removals, but it would depend very much also on the price differentials between the ETS and the removals market. There's a significant, at the moment, we have a very big gap between the ETS price and the price of removals. So this gap is expected to continue for a number of years, and for that, the ETS could not alone create that incentive to scale up the removals, at least in the short term. So all in all, whether we should integrate carbon removals in the ETS needs to be studied in detail, but it's clear that inclusion in the EU ETS cannot be at the cost of reductions, emission reductions. There are also other elements we have to look at in the review. We have to look at municipal waste. The ETS directive requires that we look at municipal waste incineration and whether it could be included in 2028. We have also to look at carbon capture, utilization and storage. So on CCU, we will review how we could account for CO2 that's captured and used in non-permanently in a product, for example, in chemicals and plastics and synthetic fuels. If we reuse the CO2 in these applications, we can avoid emissions from virgin fossil fuels feedstock, but on the other hand, it's not stored permanently and it's not equivalent to CCS. So we need to look into this issue carefully. At the last revision of the ETS directive, we decided that allowances will not have to be surrendered if there is permanent carbon capture and use. This is, for example, production of building material. But we now have to look on this in between where CCU is not stored permanently, but only for a time. And the preparation of the delegated act to operationalize the principle of this permanently stored CO2 is ongoing. But then there's also, and this is potentially a little bit further out in the future, these elements also go together. They go together and need to require an overall assessment to look at the whole CO2 value chain and whether moving towards a circular carbon cycle in the EU ETS when the cap is going to zero could be a good way forward. At the moment, we treat the embedded emissions in chemical products, e-fuels, and other non-permanent CCU products as you have to put down an allowance for this. But if we would include waste management processes, then we could potentially go to a downstream accounting, and then we could look at it in a different way. But it's a question that needs to be looked at. It's not urgent. It may not be something that needs to be settled in the 2026 review. It could also be later, as this is something that's still in very early processes. But certainly at a certain point, it could be relevant. And then finally, maybe a few words on aviation and maritime. We will also have to look at that in the review. For aviation, we have until the start of 2027 only carbon pricing for flights within the EU EEA and departing flights from Switzerland and United Kingdom. But in 2026, we will have to see whether CORSIA is delivering sufficiently. And if it's not, then the Commission will make a legislative proposal that could extend the scope of the EU ETS also to departing flights if CORSIA is not sufficiently aligned with the Paris Agreement. On the maritime, we will have to consider lowering the feasibility of the tonnage threshold for ETS inclusion and look at ways to how to enhance the MRV and how to account for the uptake of renewable and low carbon fuels in a life cycle basis and monitor potential evasive behavior and also potentially review any international market-based measures that could have been adopted by IMO. And then not directly the ETS directive, but still very much linked, we have to look at the functioning of the Market Stability Reserve that has to be reviewed every 5 years. We have reviewed it in 2021, so it's up for review again in 2026. And here we will in particular pay attention to the intake and release rates, the thresholds, alignment with the linear reduction factor, and the impact on the reserve would have on growth and jobs and the competitiveness of industry. So there is a full review of the MSR also due in 2026. Finally, a word on the timeline. We are going to start the evaluation as part of the better regulation already now. And you will see also in early 2025 that we will publish the various public consultations, simultaneously also for the impact assessment for the possible legislative proposal. And then we will have sufficient time to prepare a legislative proposal in 2026. Yes, we do expect that the overarching context for this review clause will be a decision of the 2040 climate target by co-legislature, but we could also keep in mind that we have already the review clause in any case, and we have already, if we extend current policies, we will lead to a minus 88% reduction economy-wide by 2040, even without the 2040 target being set before that. So we have different options already in place, and we will have to see how the next commission will deal with them. I think I stop for there, but I'm happy to also discuss elements of these renew clauses that we are going to look into. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mette. I think it was really a great overview of what is actually yet to come before the 2040 target is legislated. Just to confirm to everyone that Ms. Quinn decided not to have slides, so it wasn't a mistake that you haven't seen them. And this presentation was without slides, though other presentations that we planned for today will all be accompanied by slides. I suggest that we will now move to another speaker, and then after all presentations, we'll have time for exchanging between panelists, but also for questions from the audience. Louis, let me invite you right now with your presentation about navigating a new horizon of the EU ETS post-2030.
Thanks, Julia, and also thanks to Mette for an interesting kickoff to the webinar with some reflections on the 2040 target, but also then the wider policy discussion around the ETS and removals. My session today is going to focus on answering two key questions. The first is going to be a deep dive on the 2040 target that's been communicated at the 90% level, and what does this mean for the EU ETS? So that's what we're going to look at first. The second part of the presentation is going to really focus on the key themes for how the ETS will need to evolve post 2030 to enable its continued effective market functioning. Mette has already introduced some of the topics that are on everyone's minds when we think about post 2030 framework evolution, but I'll also provide our perspective on some of the points that were mentioned previously. So I'm also just going to try and navigate the slides. It doesn't look like it's working, so if I could go to the next slide and then one more after that, we'll start on looking at the first question. And we all know where we landed with the communication is a 90% 2040 target. And of course, what's been clearly highlighted is this is raise the level of ambition versus what's currently in the Fit for 55 package, and therefore this will require an acceleration in a decarbonisation pathway between 2030 to reach the 90% level by 2040. What this means, though, is that there still needs to be a legislative process before this enters legislation. So 90% is what's been communicated, but this needs to survive the scrutiny of the Parliament and the Council before this is in EU climate law. And this is where I think we should explore a range of scenarios still currently when we're looking at analysis for the 2040 target. So we know already, for example, Germany has got an 88% reduction target for the emissions in Germany with a 2045 net zero target. So the fact that 90% is above this in terms of level of ambition could mean that there may be pushback from other member states that the EU-wide policy at this level is still very, very ambitious. So potentially headwinds faced there. The other, of course, is the discussion around these hard to abate emissions, which again can be very politically divisive, especially when we think about in the context of recent pushbacks on agricultural kind of policies and emission reductions there. Overall, the 90% target is definitely what's going to, what's providing the headline here, but whether we'll end up at this level will depend on its acceptability in the kind of legislative process. So as it stands, I think in analysis, we should look at a range of scenarios. And currently this should be between the 85% and 90% range. And this is where we kind of start the discussion. When we look at the specifics of the 2040 target, again, the communication provided some details, but there is still a lack of the precisions needed to really take a deep dive on the analysis for the EU ETS at least. When we look at the target for 2040, of course, we have indicative kind of gross emissions budget of around 850 million tonnes, but there's not any information yet on how that's going to be distributed among the sectors in the EU between the ETS and non-ETS sectors, for example. And when we're looking at the removals target, which again is this quite high level, 400 million tons at this stage, there's no information yet on how this is going to be split between LULUCF and industrial removal solutions. You know, there's been some let's say indication in the impact assessment, but these let's say these precise details are not yet clear. So overall, there's a wide spectrum of uncertainty for how the 90% target, or a range 85 to 90% target, could impact the EU ETS. And there's still quite a lot of unanswered questions here. We'll move to the next slide and look at how we're kind of addressing this unanswered question and how does the 2040 target impact the EU ETS. Now, let's assume we take the 90% target that's been communicated. And the way in which we're looking at this is via the carbon budget approach. And we look at a hypothetical scenario for decarbonisation of different sectors of the EU economy between 2030 and 2040. Of course, between 21 and 2030, we're applying the Fit for 55 framework and then an acceleration post that point. There's some key assumptions that we make here. Of course, we're using the 90% target framework that was communicated by the Commission earlier this year, and that involves obviously this 850 million tonne gross emissions budget. For the sectors that are covered under ETS2, what we do, or what we assume in this analysis, is that the linear reduction factor that's implied under current legislation, it continues. So for road transport, building and small industry, those sectors reach around a 230 million tonne carbon budget in 2040. For the non-ETS sectors, this is where we're using, let's say, upper bound, a very ambitious scenario for decarbonisation. And this is obviously illustrative, but it's consistent with the most ambitious scenario put forward in the impact assessment, which provides, you know, a significant acceleration or step up in ambition within decarbonisation of the waste and also agricultural emissions. Taking those as, say, input parameters, what we get out of that is therefore a leftover carbon budget, which we can assign for the EU ETS. This allows us to kind of reach the conclusion that with a very ambitious, say, decarbonisation agenda in the non-ETS sectors, and if ETS2 continued within the LRF as it's currently under the current legislation, the gross emissions budget for the ETS could sit above zero for 2040. We have it in our modelling around 120 million tonnes in this scenario. But I think the key caveat here, of course, is that this is really presenting a hypothetical upper bound for the carbon budget within a 90% target for the EU ETS. Of course, this relies heavily on the decarbonisation of other sectors that we've exogenously assumed for this for the purpose of this modelling. But that provides us a benchmark of a 90% target still does leave space for carbon gross emissions from ETS sectors. If we move to the next slide, we can look at what this means for the cap, because this is the next part of the question. We've looked at a scenario where the carbon budget sits above zero for 2040 for the EU ETS sectors. What does this mean for the cap trajectory? Well, as Mette explained, the cap trajectory under current legislation for the EU ETS sees the market reach zero by 2040. We have a 4.4% LRF from 2030 to 2040, 90 million tonne annual reduction, and that's what the yellow dotted line shows on the slide here. However, what we've shown from the carbon budget modelling kind of scenario that we presented previously is that we do see scope for the ETS1 cap to sit above the implied cap trajectory for the ETS towards 2040 and reach this around 120 million tonne level by 2040. Like I said, there's some key uncertainties which could lead to some deviation around this green dotted line for the, say, calculated ETS1 cap. Something to mention here is obviously the ambition in the non-ETS sectors. We've put forward a hypothetical upper bound for the decarbonisation trajectories within those sectors. However, we know how politically divisive and difficult this may be to put forward such an ambitious agenda there. And therefore, if we are able to see less ambition in the agricultural sector, for example, this might be traded with more ambition in the ETS sectors, and ultimately the cap could sit closer towards that this 4.4% LRF scenario. So ambition in the non-ETS sectors is something that needs to be considered. The other point here is, of course, if you were to have less ambition in the non-ETS sectors, but wanted to try and still achieve this 120 million tonne carbon budget scenario, the only other option would be to have an increased scale up of the contribution of intra-EU carbon removals. And this again is another policy tool which will be a focus of the upcoming debate on the 2040 target and package of measures. The final uncertainty, of course, is still the 2040 target itself. We're looking at a 90% target scenario here, but within the range of 85% to 95%, the possibilities for the ETS 1 cap will also vary. A target below 90% could allow a carbon budget again to deviate further from this 4.4% LRF scenario. So in conclusion, based on our modeling, we see the ETS 1 cap likely to sit between a 3.5% LRF and 4.4% LRF between 2030 and 2040, but we do see scope for the non-zero carbon budget for the ETS sectors in 2040 based on this analysis. A question to leave us on this slide is, of course, we looked at the ETS cap from a carbon budget perspective, but it's not yet clear how the carbon budget would translate into EUA supply. Of course, we've got the question of, how does free allocation and auctioning of allowances evolve beyond 2030? But we've also got the question of, again, how are removals considered, or whether removals are considered within the system, and how does this work towards 2030? So the question remains is, if there was a carbon budget of 120 million tonnes, how would that translate into EUA supply? And that brings me on to the next slide, which is really looking at the next part of the presentation, understanding how the ETS framework will need to evolve beyond 2030. And what we've looked at in the previous slides, of course, is a market that's going to change significantly beyond 2030. The scenarios are very wide at this stage, but what's certain is this market is going to become a lot smaller, and there will be continued ambitious emission reductions targeted for those sectors covered under the system. So the market will have to evolve to continue its effective functioning. And there's some key themes that Mette has already raised, but I would like to kind of provide our view on here. Of course, you've got the intra-EU carbon removals. You can't talk about ETS post 2030 these days without mentioning this in the slide deck. The other point here is obviously ETS linkage as well, and the opportunities that can provide post 2030. And finally, I'll finish off on the MSR review. If we go to intra-EU removals first to the next slide, the European Commission, and like Mette has commented on already, there's the foundations being laid on scaling up intra-EU removals. It was mentioned throughout the 2040 target communication and the industrial carbon management strategy. We have the assessment that's due in 2026 for the emissions trading and exploring negative emissions within ETS, as well as the carbon removal certification framework that is currently going through the legislative process. So there's lots of moving parts, but the foundations are definitely being laid here. I'm not going to go into too much detail on removals because I know the next part of the session will also focus on this in quite a lot of detail. To link this back to my presentation, though, I think the extent to which removals could be integrated into the ETS and the degree of which they're integrated will ultimately help us answer that question. When we look at the carbon budget for the ETS in 2040, does that directly correspond to the amount of gross emissions that are permitted within the scheme? Of course, if you look at a carbon budget under that 4.4% LRF scenario, that would require international transport, small industry to reach zero emissions in the next 16, 17 years, which is extremely ambitious. So we know that removals will play this role to bridge the gap between the hard to abate residual emissions and the net zero targets. But of course, the extent to which removals are integrated could allow the carbon budget for the ETS to sit above this implied range that we discussed there. So 120 million tonnes under a 3.5% LRF scenario could in fact allow over 120 million tonnes to be permitted within the system if there is some degree of integration of these removals into the ETS. But again, I leave it there, but I wanted to link it back to the slides previously on this topic and let my colleagues kind of focus on this in the next part of the session. If we move to ETS linkage now on the next slide, the other point, of course, with the framework evolution is that the ETS one is going to become significantly smaller than the size of the market is today. That's obviously going to present problems, or let's say a new paradigm for the ETS, where the market could potentially become a lot less liquid, a lot smaller, and this raises questions around whether it's still going to be able to provide an effective decarbonisation signal, and how will this change in market size impact price formation within the EUA market? Lots of unanswered questions at this stage, but this reduction in liquidity obviously brings the question of how can we evolve this framework to help kind of mitigate that risk. Linkage is an option here. There's various routes of linkage that can be explored, international linkage with different ETS schemes. Of course, we know this takes a lot of time and a lot of work to coordinate ETS systems for this to work, but we see the European Commission is already setting up this global carbon market task force, and with policies such as the CBAM already targeting global carbon pricing beyond the EU's borders, this sort of linkage should not be ruled out, at least at this stage. The other sort of linkage that we kind of explore in this slide is something that's a little bit closer to home, and it's with the new ETS2 system that will come towards the end of this decade. Again, there's a lot of uncertainty here, and this is by no means, let's say, a policy recommendation, but it's just an example of how linkage between two markets that are already very closely aligned could benefit the ETS1 as we move towards zero. Of course, expanding the number of abatement opportunities available to ETS participants could help achieve more cost-effective price formation within the EU ETS. But of course, it faces difficulties such as the heterogeneity of different agents within the ETS1 versus ETS2. But then again, both of these markets are already going to be indirectly linked via the electrification route for abatement in ETS2, already if reflecting the ETS1 price via the power price. So this is definitely a point to be discussed at a later date, but linkage is definitely something that will come up on the agenda, we feel, for the post-2030 framework evolution of the ETS. To end the session, I'm going to touch on the MSR, which will be the next slide. The MSR is something that's a little bit, let's say, closer to home than what we've looked at in the previous 2 points, because we have an MSR, and this is currently still at the kind of provides foundations for EUA market dynamics. What's apparent is that towards 2030, as liquidity needs evolve in the EU ETS, there is a risk of these parameters, so the thresholds of the MSR and the intake rate, potentially becoming misaligned from this evolution of liquidity needs. We know that the significant decarbonisation expected in the power sector will mean that the liquidity needs will drop quite significantly, especially if industry, maritime and aviation are not going to provide, let's say, an offsetting impact for the liquidity need evolution there. And that's not expected. So overall, in 2030, we see this risk that the MSR no longer becomes as effective at addressing or mitigating the risks of a supply and demand shock, which ultimately is what it's there to do. Now, the kind of first point here, like Mette mentioned, is that the thresholds and their intake rates will be reviewed in 2026, and this is kind of a fairly obvious option. What it requires here is increased flexibility to the evolving liquidity needs of the ETS participants, but also changing market size. So MSR parameters that are more flexible will definitely be explored here. But what you see is, based on our forecast, the TNAC falls below the upper threshold in 2026 and then enters this void towards the end of the decade where, again, it's lack of flexibility to respond to these demand shocks. Post-2030, what's not often talked about, but we feel is one of the most important elements, is actually the lower threshold. And this is where focus is going to shift towards. Obviously, the MSR has been a key tool to reducing the historical oversupply, but beyond 2030, it's also going to be a key tool in maintaining there's enough liquidity in this market to support, say, the hedging needs of the participants beyond 2030. The problem that we see right now is that the TNAC is artificially always going to be slightly higher than the actual market surplus in the ETS. And that's because it doesn't take into account the historical cumulative net aviation demand for EUAs, as well as it not taking into account the flexibility cancellations under the effort sharing regulation. By 2030, this does mean that the actual market surplus could sit quite a fair bit below the TNAC, and that would delay the extent or delay the time it takes for the lower threshold to be triggered, and ultimately we could see this misalignment between the MSR and the liquidity needs of the market participants, whereby the TNAC would need to fall well below 200 million tons for the injection of the 400 million ton threshold to be triggered. as we look towards the review in 2026, therefore, it's not just the thresholds and the parameters that we see as important, but also the way in which the MSR is operating and the TNAC composition, therefore, which are key elements to consider. And the shift towards not just focusing on the upper threshold, but really looking at how the lower threshold functions and how this will support liquidity needs in the market will be a key point in the next review. So with that, I finish the presentation with just some key takeaways on the next slide. The 90% target obviously has been communicated, and we're in the process of digesting this communication and lengthy impact assessments, over the last 2 months. But as it stands, we should still consider a range of target scenarios in analysis, of course, because of the legislative process, and ultimately a political agreement could sit at a different level to 90% in the end. For the ETS, in the absence of increased ambition in non-ETS sectors and the scale up of intra-EU carbon removal contribution, then a 4.4% LRF is very likely to be maintained. However, if we are able to see this more widespread measures that touch different sectors, and enough ambition is agreed within the non-ETS sectors currently, then a non-zero cap in 2040 is a scenario that we're not ruling out within our analysis. And then finally, to finish off, we looked at some key themes for the ETS review, and this I definitely think will form the topic of another webinar down the line when the 2040 policy package is put forward and we have some more stuff to look at. But with that, thanks IETA for having me on today, and I hand the floor back to you, Julia.
Thank you so much, Louis. It was extremely interesting, and great presentation and detailed overlook on options on how the EU ETS may evolve. So I'm looking forward to the conversation after the presentations to discuss it further with our webinar participants. I would like to remind everyone that you can ask questions. There is a Q&A panel where you can type your questions, and afterwards we will group them and then we will read them out so our speakers can respond to those. And now I would like to invite Felix to take the floor with the presentation on the integration of carbon removals under the EU ETS, starting with a closer look on what are the estimated needs for CDRs according to the 2040 communication and the impact assessment. The floor is yours, Felix.
Thank you very much, yeah, also for the invitation. I'll try to, no, I think I can't do the slide thing. So next slide, please. I think I can't use it here. Okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about the integration of carbon dioxide removal into EU climate policy. And I think I can directly build on what Louis just said in the next slide, where I also talk a little bit about the target proposals that we just seen from the European Commission. And we have these two sort of ceilings in the 2040 recommendation from the European Commission. We've seen the numbers already by Louis. Residual emissions of 850 million tons, excluding emissions from the LULUCF sector, and then removals sort of limited to 400 million tons of what they can contribute to achieve the 2040 target. It is important to know that the wording of this specific target is quite contested and will be contested. It changed, for example, compared to the leak that we've seen before. And if we listen to the member states or also representatives from the European Parliament as reactions to the proposal, this will be part of the contestation of how the specific design of the target will look like. The idea here is, of course, to mirror what we've seen in the 2030 target, where the amount for the LULUCF removals is limited as well. But as I said, this will be contested. And I put the slide, the figure on the right, where you can see the three scenarios or the four scenarios and how the net and gross emissions are reflected in the scenario. It's important to note that the numbers 850 million tons and 400 million tons, they do not come directly from the scenarios. It's somewhere between scenario 2 and scenario 3, and this makes it very difficult to understand what the assumptions for the specific numbers are. So I think this is something that will also be discussed in the coming months. What does it actually mean for the policy instruments? And again, the co-legislators will discuss the target, and I think it is important to say again that the 90% is not set in stone. It could be something different. The appetite for more ambitious climate policy is quite limited, and the European election, of course, also plays a role here. So let's see what happens next. But next slide will be more specifically on carbon dioxide removal, and here I picked the figure on carbon removals, industrial carbon removals by source and use, and also put the numbers here for industrial carbon removals and LULUCF net removals. And I think the key message is here that for industrial carbon removals, we see the scale up between 2030 and 2040. So now really is the time to think about how to manage the scale up of industrial carbon dioxide removal to prepare that for 2030 onwards. On LULUCF removals, I think there is a lot to be said there, but maybe now I limit it here to, if you look at the numbers, they are not much higher than the target that we already have. It's 310 million tons in the LULUCF regulation that we have so far, and it doesn't go well beyond that. So it is still a challenge, of course, to achieve 310 million tons, but the numbers do not go well beyond this. So the scale-up question really is, especially for what we call novel CDR in the State of CDR report. But before I come to the State of CDR report, one more key message on this. In the models, we see direct air capture plus CCS and bioenergy plus CCS. Whether these numbers are feasible politically, but also economically and technically, I think this is a very difficult question. And in the coming years, we will see much more methods that come into play when we think about how to scale up CDR. And we see that currently that efforts of integrating new methods into the modeling. And I would assume that the numbers for BECCS and DUCs will shrink over time, and we will see other methods in this figure that I showed here. But on the next slide, I have a figure from the State of CDR report. We're currently preparing the second edition of it. It will be published in June. This is from the one that we published last year. And we sort of try to identify the carbon dioxide removal gap. And what we see is really a long way to go for novel CDR. In the gray bar, you see the overall amount of carbon dioxide removal happening today or last year. And this is 2 gigaton worldwide. And if we then zoom into the amount of novel CDR, it's super tiny and not really worth mentioning. So what we see is if we want to scale up CDR to the amount that we need in the European Union or worldwide, we really have a big job ahead of us. And really, as I mentioned earlier, have to think about what kind of policy instruments help us do that. And this brings me to the next slide. It's an overview from a paper that we recently published, led by Matthias Friedal, and Wilfried was also part of it, where we sort of try to sketch out how does the current policy landscape look like after Fit for 55, and what are key intervention points to add carbon dioxide removal to this policy architecture. And today we will of course focus on the ETS, but I think it is important to note that ETS will not do the job alone. We have to think about the whole architecture and how it may be changed in the coming years. We've already heard about the ESR, but also the LULUCF regulation when we think about other types of removals. So I think it is important to say that we do not start from scratch. It's not only about like identifying new fancy policy instruments. We really need to think systematically about how to integrate CDR into the existing system. I think there is sometimes a bias towards inventing new fancy policy instruments. That's maybe not the most plausible strategy to actually scale up CDR, I think. When we focus on the emission trading scheme, and that's already bringing me to my last slide, the next one. And here I can sort of build on what Louis already said, and also Mette, I think, because there are in the discussion 4 idealized models of how you can think of carbon dioxide removal and the ETS. And this is what we've heard as the degree of integration. You could basically think of that from model A to model D. I will briefly go through them, and then I think Wilfried will go deeper into the details. But I think this figure and these models are really helpful in structuring the debate, also when we have them with policymakers, to understand what the preferences are. And the first model A is, of course, the disconnected market, where we have a market for allowances as we currently know, the ETS1, and a separate market for removals. We see some proposals in the debate for how this market for removals could look like, but there it is, of course, also the challenging question of where does the money come from for the removals? How do you pay for the removals in a separate market? The second model is connected through government, and I will combine it with a third model connected with restrictions, because I think there is a blurry boundary of what separates this. So who sets the restrictions and conditions how CDR is integrated? So there is some kind of connections, but there is either the government in a rule-based manner structuring how CDR can be integrated in the ETS, or there are some restrictions with a new institution, for example, like a central bank or something else that defines how CDR is included in the ETS. Finally, you could, of course, also think about a fully integrated market where there are no restrictions and it's fully connected. And this is the one that provokes the most discussions, I think. So it is really worth going into details here. And we've heard about the timeline from Mette. It's until 2026. The time is running super fast if we think about where the current debate stands. So the proposals are popping up here and there. And I think it's really important to talk about the details now, and I think Wilfried really is the one who can do that. So I'm leaving it here and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Felix. You mentioned a central bank, and you also mentioned that Wilfried will continue on those reflections that you just presented with regard to options for integration of CDRs into the EU ETS. So Wilfried, I would right now like to request you to show your presentation and to share with us your reflections and your work that you have done, scientific research on a negative ETS. The floor is yours. Go ahead, please.
Hi, thank you so much. And thank you to the previous speakers for this great presentations. Like Felix, I will try whether I can navigate my own slides. Apparently not. So then I would like to start with the first slide. So I would like to focus on, in particular, this transition challenge. So, and as Felix ended very nicely, it's very different to think about each system from scratch, to set something up, an emission trading scheme with a net zero cap, for example, compared to the challenge we are facing now, transitioning from with a positive cap to a net zero cap and later potentially net negative cap. Next slide, please. This just shows allowance supply. Note that allowance supply to the market, and different at what we saw on one very nice slide by Lewis. It's not the emissions. Emissions can be different because there's banking, of course. And here you see the new linear reduction factor extrapolated towards the end. Next slide, please. Just for the record, this will be not straight lines. I mean, there will be further sectors included shipping. The correction works backwards, so there will be kinks in the slide. But important to note is what you see on the next slide. That allowance supply at some point will end, and now with the higher linear reduction factor much earlier than with the previous linear reduction factor, around 2039, 2040. And the EU ETS is supposed to continue afterwards, so be then a net negative emission trading scheme, which means the amount of removals have to exceed the emissions which are still there in the system. Next slide, please. So just to stress it once more, so this is a very different discussion, I think, now, as we had this with earlier phases of the EU ETS, when the question was how to include a certain amount of Kyoto offsets aside still then large supply. Now we are coming to the challenge that steep emission reductions required, in particular in those sectors where these decarbonization options are less clear. Even the EU ETS has been a success story so far. Main reductions were still in the energy sector, and industry with uncertain abatement prospects have now to reduce as well very quickly. And at the same time, free allocation is sinking anyway, because allowance supply is sinking, but additionally due to the introduction of CBAM. And that means we likely will enter, or that's what we expect with shrinking supply, a phase of high and volatile prices, and that might undermine political support and put then emission reduction targets at risk. So that means there will be a high future demand for carbon removal certificates. Next slide, please. However, at the moment, there's no supply of carbon removal certificates in the market. BECCS and direct air capture with carbon capture and storage would be straightforward candidates, because here monitoring, reporting, and verification is easier than with other methods, and due to their CCS part in these methods, the CCS directive already provide safeguards for physical carbon leakage, so that the CCS directive is in a sense already ready for BECCS and DACs. However, both, and particularly DACs, require learning by doing and economics of scale to come close to provide any thing like what could be considered as meaningful supply. But right now, it's not possible to generate such certificates, to supply, in a sense, certificates, because you have to have an emitting activity if to be part of the EU ETS. You see there the footnote, in a sense, would be one workaround for bioenergy, because they have an emitting activity. They are currently exempt to surrender allowances because there's an upstream correction already in the LULUCF. So in fact, with repealing that correction, giving them free allowances, bioenergy operators, they would be, in a sense, indifferent. However, they would then have an incentive to do CCS, so BECCS, so that they can supply allowances. But as I said, also this correction is still not repealed, and right now we have no supply of carbon removal certificates. Next slide, please. And now it's, I think, important, kind of with lecture style, to remember what happens. You have a carbon removal certificate, it's supplied to a market via auction, for example. Then a company buys it and surrenders it for an emission. Then you have a net zero action. However, if this carbon removal certificate is not supplied to the market, but either by the holder or by bought out by someone out, but cancelled, then you have a net negative action. And the later one is required. However, member states might be tempted to use these carbon dioxide removal too early for their 2030 emission and for the emission reductions under the effort sharing regulation. Sorry. So we think that a meaningful transition requires a sufficient carbon removal certificate in reserve. So to not use these certificates too early, in a sense. And one option to manage that would be a carbon central bank. The idea of a carbon central bank, in a sense, is not new. There have been papers on it around for several years, but most of them look at the role of a carbon central bank, which kind of manage the distribution of an existing allowance pool. But now with CDR procurement, the carbon central bank can create its own currency with a physical underlying. So basically then with operating under a gold standard. Next slide, please. And to illustrate that, I will walk you quickly to such a sequenced approach. So right now, you see here on the left side, the EU ETS, how it's working. So we have the allowance pool, which is auctioned to the market. Basically, there's still some free allocation, not shown here in detail. A certain part is directed to the market stability reserve, where you have then some cancellation. And at some point, certificates from the market stability reserve will be put again back to the market. And now the carbon central bank starts filling a new pot, so to say, the carbon removal certificate reserves by procurement from different removal companies, and just putting them into stock, because it's a stock problem. Next slide, please. And now, and at some point, the carbon central bank can decide to supply these carbon removal certificates also to the market. So in principle, we are thinking more of a broad mandate, where the mandate of the central bank is to stabilize the prices, not this kind of rule-based approach where, depending on certain triggers, certain amount of allowances will be released. But it would be still possible to keep this rule-based approach of the MSR, Market Stability Reserve, working and supplement it with additional certificates from the Carbon Certificate Removal Reserve. And you see then for the companies, it doesn't make sense. These two colors mix, so you have their homogeneous credits. Next slide. And this might become in particular relevant when the Market Stability Reserve runs empty. So we have seen that earlier. And also in our calculations, we think the Market Stability Reserve, if not adjusted, should run empty before you end the end of the allowance supply. And then this Carbon Removal Certificate Reserve would be, in a sense, your only tool, so to say, to steer and manage the market. But again, it's important to note on all these pipes, they are valves, so the central bank can steer how much they're doing. And at some point, next slide, please. The allowance pool will be gone. So that was the slide with which I started, because at some point, there will be no further allowances, we think. And then the Carbon Removal Certificate Reserve would the main tool to manage this market. And then at some point, you open an additional valve to cancel out carbon removal certificates to achieve net negative emissions, which actually have occurred earlier. But that was what I wanted to emphasize. You have there the physical flows and the accounting flows. And as long as the removal certificate is in stock, potentially be used at some point, you're always at net zero. And if you start canceling them, you get a net negative action. Next slide, please. This was, of course, now very conceptually. The further services could be provided by the CCB. Felix showed, I think, very well that the supply of BECs and DAX might not be sufficient, and further CDR methods or supply of further CDR methods will be needed. They will be happen, and that they will have different ratings in terms of permanence of storage and market stability. Not market stability, monitoring, reporting, verification issues, sorry. And the Carbon Central Bank could then provide clearinghouse services by converting this different carbon removal into homogeneous carbon removal certificates. So for the company using carbon removal certificates, it doesn't make a difference if it comes from BECs, DAX, or enhanced weathering. And that's required for a continuation of a liquid market. And of course, you can think of further services. Such a conversion could be supported by active carbon portfolio management of an impermanence reserve. Such an impermanence reserve might be relevant if at some point international removal credits under Article 6.4 will be integrated. They are derived under cost-benefit framework like ton-year accounting, and it's then challenging to integrate them in the EU compliance framework where you have a target, so not a cost-benefit consideration. And therefore, to ensure permanence, you would have to set a certain amount of credits aside. And that could be done by active carbon portfolio management. And this role of the CCB would not necessarily be restricted to the EU ETS 1, because Felix showed the different pillars, and Luis already showed how these at some point might converge. And right now, there are already flexibilities between the different pillars, so it's possible to transfer a limited amount of removal credits from the LULUCF to the effort sharing regulation. And within the effort sharing regulation, you have already trading between member states, so there is already limited trading possible of removal credits. And once emission reductions are you still see my slides? Good. I just keep talking if you like. Or is it just the three of us? No. So my point was that at some point, when there are no emission reductions any longer, then the flexibilities between these pillars will be restricted to CDR. and that could be managed by a CCB. And this different schemes shown by Felix at the end, it's not necessarily that we think that the carbon or a carbon removal bank or a similar institution should do it forever. It might very likely that you have then also at some point direct trade, for example, with BECS and DAX between emitters and removers, where then the CCB acts on this market as a large buyer and supplier and steering this market and ensuring that this net negative fraction is achieved. Last and final slide, please. Yeah, just to wrap it once more up, and what I really want to stress, it's really about now the transition dynamics, what we are thinking about. And at the same time, we know for BECS and DAX, we still need considerable learning and economics of scale effects without undermining abatement efforts. And therefore, we think such an upfront carbon removal procurement program, which only conditionally, remember the valves, supply later at a later stage these certificates to the market, is very different to integrating them unconditionally with subsidies, like, for example, with carbon contracts for difference. And we see a carbon central bank as a possible design option for such a conditional integration, but of course that needs still to be sorted out and should also be aligned what's happening internationally, of course. I mean, the EU is not isolated from the rest of the world and has to see what's happening on this Article 6.4 development. But filling such a carbon removal reserve is necessary for the transition, we believe, and the start always filling it up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wilfried. We had really a great input for the discussion to take place right now. We have a number of questions from the audience. Thank you for that. I tried to group them so we can hopefully get a reply from our panelists to all of those. But first, let me ask whether there are any comments that a panelist would like to still come up with before we move to a Q&A session. And I would just ask everyone to be brief, as we have less than 20 minutes, and we'll try to ensure that all questions are asked. Are there any urgent comments or reactions, clarifications from Mette, Louis, Felix, and Wilfried?
There's quite a lot to look at. The post-2030 framework, I think, will be kept very busy.
Definitely, we will all be probably meeting at further webinars to discuss it. But if there are no immediate reactions, let me then move to questions that we received from the audience. I would like to start with questions on the central bank that we have just heard about a lot from Wilfried, and then to move to questions about industrial abatement, MSR, social acceptance of linking ETS 1 and 2, and CORSIA. There are probably more questions coming, but for the moment, this is what I have noted looking at the Q&A panel and the chat where the questions have been raised. I think that the Mette and Wilfried would be best placed to reply to a couple of questions about the central bank, and starting with the one on how the different use of CDRs will work with the IPCC accounting and the Paris Agreement. This is specifically a question to you, Wilfried. And then a question that I believe Mette is well positioned to reply, whether the Commission is actually considering to set up a removals buying facility, for instance, as auctions or from funds, as this is the model that someone noted has been successfully developed in Australia to develop instruments in removal projects, and whether the Commission would be perhaps well placed to take on the role outlined for the European Central Bank. So instead of creating new separate institutions, could the Commission play that role and provide tasks that Wilfried outlined for the institution like the Carbon Bank? And Mette, maybe I'll ask you to go first, and then Wilfried to complete with your insights, replies to these questions.
Yes, thank you, Julia. So Could the Commission be a carbon central bank? I think for this, it's not really the question we should start with, but the question is, what are the functions, what are the tasks that really need to be provided? And then we need to find the place where that's best being done. So we need to indeed look into what kind of restrictions would want to put on a market, or what kind of release mechanisms would we like to have, and then we could see how that's best being done. So I think we need to answer those questions on what exactly are the tasks that needs to be done before we can decide who it is. And yeah, so it's too early to say would that be the Commission or not. We need to first have a very clear idea of what it is, which task we want to potentially to take on. Yeah, I think I leave it there for now.
Julia, you're muted. So, but I'm supposed to say I'm supposed to pick up.
Yes, I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
Just to comment on that, I think for the CCB, as I will in the end really a CCB or similar institution, it would be very helpful to be independent, because that makes the strength of the EZB. And there will always be then the pressure in terms of high prices to potentially release too much carbon removal certificates. And in a sense, it would then probably easier to give then the CCB a strong mandate to manage the market, but have it in a sense isolated from political pressure. On the accounting, I cannot say in a sense in such a short term. I'm not sure whether you are now referring to how it counts under the NDCs, or whether you mean, so the question was also Paris Agreement. Are you referring to removal trading, which could be developed under Article 6.4? So I was a bit pointing into this direction, that for, I mean, there's in particular the challenge with non-permanent removals. And there are different accounting approaches who assign a value to non-permanent removal, which is based under cost-benefit consideration, because there is a benefit to temporary removal. However, once you have such a compliance framework, which has a fixed cap as the EU, you have a problem in importing, in a sense, such credits. And therefore, you have to ensure that the removal is permanent. And that was what I was stressing or wanted to explain with this impermanence reserve. So a certain amount of credits has to be aside in buffer accounts. That's happening already in certain voluntary and compliance mechanisms in the US. But these buffer accounts are not yet actively managed as a bank would do it, for example, with their credit portfolio. And to ensure that the sufficient amount is set aside, but that this amount is as small as possible, which you achieve with carbon portfolio management. And that's in particular interesting because from this permanence management perspective, there's a demand for removal credits, which also which might be not AAA rating, as it would be the case with BEX and DAX, but would be still have a high permanence or non-correlation with the impermanence risk of, for example, afforestation. So there would be the demand for several ocean-based methods or enhanced weathering, because putting them into your portfolio would allow to reduce your impermanence reserve. So that would be, I think, an important task such an institution could take if it's connected to the international carbon market, what will likely be happen at some point.
Thank you very much, Wilfried, and thank you, Mette. I will now move to our two questions that are addressed specifically to Louis. The first one is about industrial abatement. What if the industrials implement emission reductions much slower, and then industry emissions will stay high despite elevated EU ETS prices, potentially causing tighter market balances with such a rapidly declining ETS cap? And let me also immediately ask a second question that came to you, Louis. Which is about your views on dynamic thresholds for the MSR to be introduced in the future.
Okay, cool. I start with the first. I think this is also kind of echoes the point that Wilfried made in his presentation. We've looked at a lot of straight lines during the session, straight lines of the cap, and the carbon budgets I put forward in my slides are also, these top-down approach towards, emission trajectories between 2030 and 2040, and I think it's a really good point. The speed of which the supply or cap or carbon budget declines for the ETS sectors could very well outpace the speed of which we see industry abatement materialize in the market, and therefore a tighter balance and a kind of a further depletion of the surplus in the ETS should definitely not be ruled out. I think right now for industry abatement, the key challenges that will be that will need to continue to be addressed now, but also in the post-2030 framework is kind of overlapping policy and the financial support that can help facilitate this abatement. I think in the Q&A I saw kind of a comment around carbon contracts of difference, and I think it's about allowing the ETS price to provide that investment signal, but also supporting policies that can help us facilitate this, say, decarbonisation of industry that can allow this market to function with the kind of trajectory beyond 2030 that's currently outlined. But it will be a challenge, and I think this is definitely something when we think about the functioning of the MSR and how this mechanism will provide stability for the market going forward, that this will need to shift from addressing the risk of historical oversupply to making sure that the market has sufficient liquidity to meet the needs of the current ETS participants. And like we say, there could be periods in which that liquidity demand does not decline at the same rate of which the cap or supply of allowance is declining. So this is where kind of the post-2030 framework needs to provide a bit more flexibility for this last kind of, the second leg of decarbonisation there. And I guess that leads on to the next point as well around the MSR. I saw a couple of questions on this. So I'll answer one first on the TNAC, not accounting for the historical aviation demand. Yes, from 2024 onwards, EU AA supply as well as emissions from aviation will be included in the TNAC calculation, but it's not considering the cumulative demand that has occurred between 2013 and 2023. So there's still this residual surplus that's not considered in the TNAC calculation because the recent reform has not accounted for the fact that, or does not take into account the historical aviation emissions. And therefore we still see this gap persisting, this kind of 180 to 200 million ton net demand gap that creates this difference between the actual surplus and the TNAC value. So there was going forward, the aviation will be included, but this does not address the fact that it's the historical net emissions which are creating this gap that I put on the slide. In terms of the dynamic MSR thresholds, again, I echo the point that I mentioned previously. Flexibility is going to be key going forward. I think the MSR needs to become more adaptable to the changing liquidity needs as well as the potential changes in market size. We speak about market declining in terms of cap, but we also have spoken about introducing new sectors. What happens if aviation is extended to include flights beyond the current scope, if CORSIA is not deemed eligible anymore, and what happens with integration of potentially waste incineration? The MSR is going to have to change or be flexible to these changes, and so I think some degree of dynamic threshold is definitely something that could benefit the functioning of the reserve. However, I would say what's most important for the EUA market is certainty on how the parameters will evolve. The MSR has been a fantastic tool in providing this certainty over future supply, because there's a quantity-based, rule-based mechanism. It's not discretionary intervention. So we can really see when this is going to kick in. And so dynamic thresholds going forward still need to provide that level of certainty for this mechanism to kind of maintain its important role in supporting price evolution in the market. So I think, yeah, this is my points on those two questions. Julia?
Thank you so much, Luis. And now I will move to a question that is, the first question is addressed to Mette, and the second one I would like to ask Mette and Felix to reflect on. So the question is whether you can, Mette, tell us a little bit more on the current thinking in the Commission about the downstream and upstream carbon accounting, and maybe also a little bit on the EU ETS 2 in that context. What other downstream sectors, what downstream sectors might be impacted by the ETS 2? Although I know that we are focusing on ETS 1, the ETS 2 obviously has been mentioned as a relevant element in our thinking on how the EU ETS may evolve post 2030. And on accounting, the second question is on how the accounting of ETS with integrated carbon dioxide removals can be considered under CBAM. Is this something, Mette, that the Commission has been already thinking about? And Felix, if you can afterwards add to that, whether you've been also looking into that in your research, as you mentioned briefly CBAM in your presentation, just wonder whether you've been already exploring that a little bit more in detail.
Yes, thank you, Julia. So upstream and downstream accounting. So on the ETS and the ETS 2, if I start there, we are going to start, of course, with the upstream accounting with the fuel suppliers that will be the relevant compliance entities, and what does that mean for the downstream sectors? I mean, it means that it's the downstream sectors that are ultimately impacted, but indeed it's the upstream sectors that are going to have the burden, as the costs are going to be passed on to the final users in the ETS. This is where the effect will be felt, and I think this is where we will see. Yeah, I mean, this is of course where we will see the change. I don't think we have any further concerns in that regard to ETS 2. We have placed it as we have because it's a manageable system. Further downstream would be very, very challenging to have so many entities in the system. So it's in order to create a manageable system that we have chosen the way we have done it in ETS 2. It does create some accounting issues also between ETS 1 and ETS 2, because we have a different system in ETS 1, and this is one of the issues that we have been dealing with and been reflecting very much for the implementing legislation, and how to ensure that there's not double payments in the system for now that we have industry also in ETS 2. So it's a little bit of a challenge to see between the ETS 1 and the ETS 2, but we are trying to put in place rules so it's possible to distinguish what is ETS 1 and what is ETS 2. And indeed, in case that you have double payment, then there is a possibility for member state to compensate in the system, to compensate where you have been paying twice, and this is also a rule that has to be very carefully looked at, and we have to have a cap adjustment also in ETS 2, where this has been captured and therefore have been addressed. So it is a little bit complex in the implementing rules, but I think we are finding the way forward in making it possible to to distinguish what is ETS 1 and what is ETS 2 accounting and possible compensation where it's too challenging to figure it out and therefore have to compensate afterwards. In relation to CBAM and accounting of, sorry, what was the question again on that?
If carbon removals are recognized under
yes.
ETS, what would it mean
Yes.
for the CBAM?
Yes, indeed. There is, I mean, there is a possibility to allow for systems where removals has been allowed for in the ETS. So we might have, so in order to count for an ETS relevant for the CBAM, it's not excluded that other ETSs have removals, but it has to be kind of a small element and not a big element. But there is some possibilities there. The rules are not fully set out in implementing legislation yet. But this is what we are looking at in the methodologies that we have to adopt under the CBAM. So there is a little opening for some removals, as we also see some ETSs around the world have removals in the system, which is different from the EU ETS. But it will have to be a smaller element, and this is where we will have to set the implementing legislation together with Taxus, of course, who is responsible in this area.
Thank you, Mette. And Felix, I would like to invite you for a short commentary on this latter topic, whether having CDRs in ETS is something, and its impact on CBAM accounting is something that you are perhaps looking into.
Yeah, I think I don't have much to add to what Mette just said. I think the issue didn't receive enough attention yet, so I think we do have to work on these interactions, and we've discussed it as part of a paper not published yet, but we will look at this, and I think it is an important area. So CDR has an external dimension, so we need to take care of what is observe what is going on in other countries, but also what is going on in member states. I think I'd just like to add that we shouldn't lose sight during these discussions on the ETS. We also need to understand what do member states do, how does it align with carbon contracts for difference in Sweden, in Germany, whatever we see policies for CDR, we need to make sure that the ETS works together with them. I think that's the other challenge that we also shouldn't lose sight of.
Thank you, and thank you to all panelists and to all participants that joined us for this session. I'm really sorry that we have not managed to reply to all your questions. There are many of them, and they're really interesting ones, and probably we can spend another hour discussing this subject. The good news is that there is a great opportunity coming next week to continue these conversations. I would like to invite all of you to join us in Florence for the European Climate Summit, IETA's flagship event on the EU climate policy, with about 500 participants joining us next week from 16 to 18 of April to discuss these and many other issues relevant currently on the EU policy agenda, but also relevant globally. So if you have not yet plans for next week and you haven't yet booked your place, we invite you to join us in Florence to continue this conversation. At the moment, we unfortunately have to end. We are a few minutes over time, but we also started a couple of minutes later. So I hope you can accept that we went a little over time. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. I found it myself very interesting, very informative, and I hope you enjoyed it too. Wish you all a very nice day. Thank you.